Over the last several years, there's just been a non-stop barrage of movies from my childhood being remade, reimagined, sequeled, requeled, prequeled, whatever you can imagine. They're bringing the properties from my childhood back to the big screen. But that's led to a lot of confusion because people loosely use a lot of different terms that mean different things. So what I want to do is just talk about the difference between a reboot and a remake. They're not the same thing, but they're very similar, so let's talk about the difference. First, a remake is a recreation of a story that has been told before. The idea is that if you take a story with a certain set of characters, a certain set of plot points, a certain premise, and take that and tell it a second time. So Ben-Hur is a remake of several movies that have been made before, as well as a classic story that has been told many times before. Or coming up, The Magnificent Seven. That is a remake of a story that has been told before, and The Magnificent Seven is the remake of Seven Samurais, a specific story with specific types of characters told again. So if you were to remake Indiana Jones, that would have to be a retelling of the story Raiders of the Lost Ark or Temple of Doom or Last Crusade. You would take that story with that character and remake that story. A reboot is when you restart the continuity for a character or a concept without necessarily retelling the same story. So consider Batman. Batman has been rebooted a number of different times where it's the same character with the same certain principles, the same rogues gallery, but they keep rebooting the continuity, and it's not retelling the same story about the Joker. It's not telling the same story about Mr. Freeze. Though Mr. Freeze and the Joker might appear, it's the same characters with different stories and a different continuity. But the idea is that a remake retells a story, and a reboot restarts over a continuity with specific characters or a specific concept. So you think about something like Indiana Jones. If you don't want to retell Raiders of the Lost Ark, you can reboot Indiana Jones and tell new stories with a new actor in that role, and just tell more adventures with Indiana Jones that aren't one of the previously told stories. Or with Sherlock Holmes, there's so many reboots, even right now, that are currently going, of Sherlock Holmes, but they're not all remakes of each other. They're reboots of the character Sherlock Holmes. Now, Sherlock Holmes gets confusing because something like a specific story like The Hound of Baskerville has been retold 30 times according to Wikipedia. So that is a remake of that story, but it's not necessarily a reboot of every version of it. It's not every time you tell that story it's rebooted. That's where these terms get a little bit confusing because one deals with characters and situations and concepts, one deals with specific stories where you're remaking a story versus rebooting a character or a concept. Now it gets even a little bit more confusing because not all reboots are equal in depth to which they reset the universe. So you have soft reboots where the story is reset, but there are still ties to the previous continuity. So, for example, Star Trek 2009 is a whole reboot of Star Trek. However, they tied it back to the old continuity by having Spock Prime travel through time. So there's a realm or way in which this is still tied to the old Star Trek, but it's a totally new Star Trek. Or coming up in a few months, they're doing a soft reboot of 24. It's still connected to the continuity in the universe of the old TV series 24. However, this is a new set of characters and a new environment. And so it's a reboot, a soft reboot, because it's not totally resetting the universe. Then there are hard reboots. These are total resets of the continuity. So Batman Begins clearly is not a continuation of Tim Burton or Joel Schumacher's Batman. It's a new, self-contained continuity that has been totally reset with no connections to the previous one. Sometimes it gets a little bit tricky to define exactly which one it is. So take Ghostbusters 2016. Different characters, different story, same premise. So it's essentially a reboot and it's essentially a remake, but it's kind of a mix of the both because it's kind of the same story, but it's different. Definitely a new continuity, but it's not clearly defined as a remake, even though it's kind of is really a remake of the original. So sometimes they kind of make it a little bit tricky to exactly define which type it is. Other times you have stories like Tarzan, which has been rebooted and remade countless times, but it's not always clear which one it is. So you can easily remake the story of Tarzan and him being found by Jane and them falling in love. That's a story that's been told before. Now, The Legend of Tarzan doesn't do that. It reboots the story and tells a new story. So it's not a remake of that old story, but at the same time, the flashbacks have a remake of this story, but the story as a whole is just a reboot. So you can see where it gets a little bit confusing. Or take, for example, Star Wars The Force Awakens. Clearly not a reboot by any stretch of the imagination. It's a continuation of the story that we've had, just a new episode in this continuity. At the same time, the story is kind of a remake of Episode 4. Not explicitly, but you can see there's definitely a remake aspect of that in The Force Awakens, while not being a reboot in any way, shape, or form. It's telling a similar story that's with the same kind of plot beats, the same big blow up the Death Star at the end, while being within the same continuity. The reason I wanted to talk about this is because I believe that terms matter, in having precise language to distinguish between two different things and not interchanging words that mean different things. It helps us to have deeper and more meaningful discussions about movies and stories and television when we know what we're saying. While reboot and remake sound the same, they're not. They mean different things, and one deals with stories and the other deals with characters. And when you clearly define what you're talking about, it makes for much richer discussion and much more meaningful discussion when we can agree on our language and talk on the same terms and not just throw around everything's a reboot, it's a continuation, well, it's a reboot, this sequel, it's a reboot. No, everything isn't a reboot. A reboot is when there's some element of a new continuity, a new continuation, a new something, not just more of the same. And a remake is telling the same story again. It is remaking this story, whereas a reboot is rebooting this universe, this character. If you like this video, please consider checking out this video right over here called When Does a Movie Bomb?, where I talk about what is a movie bomb, a flop, trying to specify language once again. A bunch of people in the comment section appeared to take it as me defending the movie Ghostbusters, which I would now say definitely flopped, but check that video out if you're interested in kind of the intricacies of language and the distinctions of it, like I did in this one about reboots and remakes. Thank you for watching this video. If you like it, please click that subscribe button. I would love to have you check out more videos, and really, I don't want to just talk about movies, I want to talk with you about movies. So join us in the comment section. What do you think is the difference between a reboot and a remake? I want to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you for watching. See you next time.